Okay, cool. Today what I'm going to be offering is an analysis of, or a theory of epistemic justification that I think is what we need if we wanted to adequately incorporate the insight that we get from Mercier and Sperber. So in some ways, what I want to do is say like, hey, if we as epistemologists accepted Mercier and Sperber's view, what would we have to do to our theory of doxastic justification to accommodate it? So what are some of the epistemic normative consequences that come about once we accept a view like the interactionist thesis? And so what I'm going to do is say, hey, you know, if we accept that the most plausible theory of doxastic justification is historical, if we accept Mercier and Sperber's view, then what I'm going to say is, well, we need to posit that justification-conferring processes, the things that confer justification on our beliefs, can be interpersonally and interactively extended. So I'm going to say more about what that means, but just in broad strokes right now, what that means is that the process that confers justification on an individual subject's belief can extend beyond her individual cognition and include her interactive dialogue with her colleagues. And what I'm going to argue is that an interesting and significant consequence of this claim is that not everything that's justification conferring is evidential. And so there's a sense in which what I'm arguing for here not only disrupts the particular framework that I'm working on, process reliabilism, but also serves as a pretty strong objection against other theories of doxastic justification like evidentialism. Okay. So the plan, I'm going to start out by talking about what I mean by a historical theory of doxastic justification and motivating why we need it. I'm then going to get into Mercier and Sperber's interactionist theory, though I feel very lucky that maybe I don't have to spend a lot of time on that exegesis, given we've been talking about it quite a bit. And then I'm going to argue how putting these together, we recognize that there's a sort of a yet unexplored kind of epistemic reliance that we can draw out of Mercier and Sperber's work, and how that kind of epistemic reliance should be accommodated by a theory of doxastic justification. I'm going to say why I think individualistic approaches don't work. And ultimately, I think my diagnosis of why individualistic approaches don't work gives me that step 5, not all that is justification conferring is evidential. And I'm hoping to get to one objection that I'd like to anticipate and respond to. All right, so that's the plan. Okay, so when we're talking about doxastic justification, we're talking about what makes it the case that my belief has a certain kind of standing, right? We take justification to be a necessary condition for knowledge. And what's essential about a historical theory of doxastic justification is that it's committed to the position that facts about what occurs prior to the moment of belief formation or an evaluation are relevant to determining the justificatory status of the belief. So why might I accept this? Well, I think a really easy way to glom on to the need for a historical theory of justification is by contrasting propositional and doxastic justification. So we can imagine two subjects, both with the same evidence set, but only one, let's say Kate, properly bases her belief that P on that evidence set. Stephen fails to do so. His belief that P is the product of wishful thinking, right? So despite them both possessing the same evidence, we're going to have this intuition that only Kate is doxastically justified. Why? Well, because she properly bases her belief that P on her evidence, Stephen does not. So if we were to take a snapshot of both of their cognition, sort of at the moment of belief evaluation or the belief formation, we might say, well, hey, they both have the same evidence set, but we have to look at what causes them to form that belief that P, or what sustains that belief that P. We have to look at that notion of proper basing. So we have to look at things that happened prior to the moment of belief formation or evaluation when we care about doxastic justification. Okay, so that's just, I think, one easy way to motivate what's going on here. So if we agree that proper basing is a necessary condition of doxastic justification, we think that basing is a causal relation. And at least when it comes to these kinds of epistemic cases, causation can be temporally extended in this kind of way, then we get the need for a historical theory of doxastic justification. But what I want to focus on is that I think what a commitment to these kinds of historical theories of doxastic justification ultimately make us really aware of, or ought to be, what it is that we ought to care about, is this kind of explanatory requirement that theories of doxastic justification must ultimately meet. What do I mean by that? Well, why do we care that Kate properly based her belief that P on the evidence? Why does that say something good about her epistemic state? Well, it's a reason for thinking that it's just not an accident that she gets at the truth, right? When Stephen bases his belief that P on wishful thinking, even if P is true, we think it's just lucky, right? And so our intuitions and our evaluations of doxastic justification are really tracking these evaluations of accidentality, of luck, right? That's the kind of thing that we care about. That's the kind of thing that we're looking to see whether it's present or not present. And so what I want to claim, and I don't take this to be particularly controversial, and in fact, the reason that I use the notion of proper basing is to say, like, hey, this is something that the evidentialists already are signing on for. This is not necessarily the controversial part of this talk. But what's required for a theory of doxastic justification to be plausible is that it needs to not only give the correct verdicts, it needs to accurately account for all the relevant parts of the non-accidentality explanation for the truth or the falsity of a subject's belief, right? So if there's something that's relevant, epistemically relevant to explaining why a subject is not merely lucky in forming their true belief, the theory of doxastic justification has to account for it. It has to play some role in explaining why the subject's belief is justified, right? So if a theory of doxastic justification doesn't account for something that's an epistemically relevant part of the explanation for why a subject's belief isn't just true by luck, then there's something wanting about that theory. There's something that it's failing to explain. Okay, so this is this kind of condition that I'm placing on any kind of plausible theory of doxastic justification. And again, I don't take this necessarily to be the particularly controversial part, though perhaps it is. Okay, sorry, I just converted this to a different thing. That's why the formatting's off. But okay, so now that we have this notion or this need for a historical theory of justification, we have this explanatory desideratum in place. I want to turn to talking about Mercier and Sperber's view. Again, I'm not going to necessarily spend a ton of time on this because we've talked about it so far already. But you know, the nuts and bolts, reasoning is a social competence, right? Its primary function is here's how I like to characterize it. Mercier and Sperber aren't claiming that reasoning doesn't serve any kind of intellectual benefit for individuals. Rather, it only does so through social interactions with others. So there are individual intellectual benefits that can come about through reasoning, but we achieve those by interacting with others in these kinds of dialogues. So I take there to be this sort of like primary or intermediary function where what we try and do when we reason is we try and convince others of what we believe. We try and figure out whether or not we ought to believe what other people are telling us. There's this sort of like intermediary social coordination or convincing kind of aim. But then this ultimate aim is the epistemic good, right? The idea that we're getting better beliefs, we're making better decisions. Okay, and so one strength of their view is that it gets to make sense of features of our reasoning that sometimes people have taken to or characterized as flaws. So for example, the my side bias, again, we talked about this yesterday. I'd be curious to know how the considerations from that talk bear on this thesis, but we'll leave it there for now. So the last thing that I want to highlight about Mercier and Sperber's view before moving on to presenting my own theory of doxastic justification is this feature that I don't think we've talked as much about. And it's this idea that I think is in Mercier and Sperber that it is not just the idea that when we deploy reasoning in these social contexts, we sort of socially bootstrap or collectively get our way to the truth. That part of the, well, what I want to highlight is that I think in Mercier and Sperber, what we find is an argument that what explains that is that these cognitive capacities are tripped or are prompted when we find ourselves in those settings, right? So why is it that, you know, I'm not particularly good at anticipating counter arguments. I'm not particularly good at evaluating or defending my own views in isolation. When confronted with the need, the social need to do so, it's that prompting from others that triggers the cognitive capacity in me. and prompts me to produce those reasons, right? So I just wanted to highlight that part of their view, that idea that it's the need or the social demand that prompts the individual cognition that, when deployed in concert with others, allows us to pave our way to epistemic goods. Okay. All right, so questions for epistemologists. What do we do with this? How do we work this into our existing frameworks, our existing ideas about justification, for example? So surely it's the case that dialogical deliberation, this kind of social giving and asking for reasons with others, can be part of the history of our belief, right? Can be part of the causal story of our belief. I've argued that we should adopt a historical theory of justification. Should we think that dialogical deliberation can be part of the belief's history that impacts justification? Should it be part of the epistemically relevant history of a belief, such that it can, dialogical deliberation can be part of what justifies our belief, what confers justification on our belief, right? Is it an epistemically relevant part of the belief's history? And I'm going to say yes, I think it can be in this particularly interesting way. So the crux of my argument is as follows. What we get in Mercier and Sperber is an argument for what I think as epistemologists we should draw out of Mercier and Sperber is an argument for the following. When a subject engages in epistemically healthy dialogical deliberation, right? So why do I say epistemically healthy? I say epistemically healthy because we need a diversity of views, right? That's one of the things we need, these countervailing my-side biases to keep one another's cognitive dispositions in check. We need active engagement, etc. When we engage in this kind of dialogical deliberation and form beliefs as a result, part of what explains why it's not just an accident that we get at the truth is our social engagement with others. It is that kind of dialogical deliberation that it's part of what's explaining why it's not merely luck that we're getting at true beliefs as a result of engaging in these contexts. And as I said before, I think an explanatory desideratum that any theory, any good theory of doxastic justification must meet is that it's got to make room for all features, all relevant features of the non-accidentality explanation, right? So what are we getting from Mercier and Sperber? I say we're getting reasons to think that dialogical deliberation is part of why it's not just an accident that we get at the truth when we collaborate with others in dialogue. And because that's part of the explanation for why it's not just an accident that we get at the truth, we've got to account for it in our best theory of doxastic justification. Okay, so how would a particular theory of doxastic justification incorporate this insight? So I was curious to see how this would work on a process reliabilist framework. So process reliabilism is, roughly speaking, the view that a belief is justified when it's the output of a reliable belief-forming process. There are, of course, more details, conditionally reliable belief-forming processes, et cetera, but those are the big features. And traditionally, what process reliabilists have said, and this goes back to Goldman, is that the relevant process that confers justification on an individual subject's belief is relegated to her individual cognition. And the thought is something like, well, justification is a measure of how an individual subject navigates her environment, right? So it's important that we're evaluating her cognitive processes. But what I'm worried about and why I'm sort of positing a new kind of justification conferring process is that I don't think that if we stay committed to the idea that justification conferring processes end at an individual subject's cognition, we're not going to be able to explain the interactionist insight that we get from Mercier and Sperber. We can only accommodate the insight that dialogue is part of the non-accidentality explanation if we extend the process outside the individual subject's cognition. Okay, so my thought is we have this interactionist insight, we have this I sort of argue that we should draw this idea out of Mercier and Sperber that part of the non-accidentality explanation for the truth of beliefs formed in dialogical deliberation is the social interaction. How do we explain that on a process reliabilist framework? Well, we explain that by saying that justification conferring processes extend beyond the individual and incorporate her interaction with her peers, with her dialogical peers, the back and forth of the dialogue, the giving and asking for reasons, the demand for justification, the offering of counterexamples, etc. And I'm going to call these interactive belief forming processes. Okay. Just before we get to that, I just want to put it in a slightly different way. One way of characterizing what I'm arguing for here is that when we accept the interactionist insight from Mercier and Sperber, we're confronted with accepting a new kind of epistemic reliance. So it seems to me that traditionally what epistemologists have cared about when it comes to social epistemic reliance is reliance on one another's reliability. So to what extent do I rely on others in my epistemic life? Well, I rely on them to tell me the truth, right? I rely on them for experts to tell me what I ought to do within the domains of their expertise. I rely on my peers to tell me when to get to the train on time, etc. And what we see in Mercier Sperber is a different kind of epistemic reliance, is what I'm arguing for. It's a epistemic reliance on one another to engage in dialogue, right? I need you to prompt the cognition in me. I need you to ask me to defend my view in order to produce these reasons that when we use these kinds of cognitive processes in concert together, allow us to bootstrap our way as a group to the truth. So it's a very different kind of epistemic reliance than what we've seen before in the epistemological literature. It's not reliance on reliability, it's reliance on engagement, dialogical engagement. So I just wanted to throw an example up there of a dialogue just so I can refer back to these characters and what follows. So we can imagine a hiring committee, right? And they're trying to decide who should we hire. They're having this, deliberation. They're engaged in dialogue with one another. Well, Madeline says Michelle went to a top-ranked MBA program. Kevin pushes back on that, notes that she has minimal work experience. This is what prompts Tanya to offer different kinds of considerations. So let's say that this group goes through this dialogue, ends up with a justified belief that Jesse is the most qualified candidate. What explains why it's not an accident? Let's say it's true that Jesse is the most qualified. What explains why it's not an accident that they ended up with a true belief? Importantly, it's not just the reliability of the interlocutors, it's the fact that they engaged in the interaction. It's the fact that they asked for reasons. It's the fact that they offered the counterexamples. It was their deliberative participation that's part of what explains why they were reliable in this case. Okay. So at this point, I would imagine that some folks might want to argue, we can get this interactionist insight without having to give up the idea that belief forming justification conferring processes end at an individual's cognition. How could we do that? Well, let's just say, we could aggregate an individual's, the reliability of an individual's instances of reasoning that occur within the deliberation, right? So you take all the instances of reasoning that the individual did, you aggregate the reliability judgments of those, and then you get this kind of like chopped up, but you put them together, belief justification conferring process, and that's what we use. Here's my worry about this. When we look back at the dialogue, let's say that Tanya's reasoning is like very much driven by the myaside bias. Let's just say that she's like a super biased reasoner in this case. So first off, if we were to take out just like all of her individual acts of reasoning and aggregate them, it's not clear that they would be reliable, even if she ended up with a true belief at the end. So it's not clear how that could explain why we might think her belief is justified. But moreover, let's take a look at what would explain her other deliberative participants' justificatory statuses. If we, so let's say so Tanya's reasoning is biased, but these deliberative participants end up with a true justified belief at the end. If we go for a kind of aggregationist, individualistic aggregationist route, my view is that we're going to end up saying that they are justified in spite of the biased reasoning from Tanya, rather than because of it. right? So the thought is something like, if we looked at Tanya's reasoning in isolation from the group, if we were to pull it out and look at it as just a solitary piece of ratiocination, I did not pronounce that correctly, my apologies. If we were to look at it separately, we would have to say, well, that's bad reasoning, right? She shouldn't do that by herself. But it's only when we put it in the context of the group that it ends up being an epistemic good. And so if we take an individualistic approach, if we don't think about the piece of reasoning as part and parcel of the interaction, we end up saying something like, oh, the group members are justified in spite of that bias. But it's precisely because of the bias that Mercier and Sperber are telling us that we're aiming at the truth in these kinds of dialogical contexts, right? So it's a failure to capture the interactionist insight fully on the individualist aggregation approach. Another view that I've heard, or that someone's offered me as well, why not just think that, they go through this dialogical deliberation, they put a bunch of reasons out there, they put a bunch of arguments out there, and then they have a bunch of evidence, and there's some point where each individual committee member looks at that evidence and forms the right belief. And it's just that moment that does the justatory work for the individual participant's belief. It's that end of discussion, the evidence is on the table, I operate on the evidence. You could go an evidentialist route, you could go a process reliabilist route. Why not just think that is the right way to capture the interactionist insight? And again, my worry is that it's failing to satisfy that explanatory desideratum, right? It's failing to explain part of the reason why it's not merely an accident that these group members have arrived at these individually true beliefs, right? It is because of the biased reasoning. It's because of the reasoning that looks very bad when you pull it out of the group context that these group members are getting at the truth. And so when we go for this kind of individualistic route that just looks at the very last moment of the dialogical deliberation, we're missing from the explanation, we're missing from our explanation of doxastic justification something that's relevant for explaining why it's not just luck that they get at the truth. Okay. So what my diagnosis of why these individualistic approaches won't work involves is saying that incorporating the interactionist insight requires making room for interactionist epistemic reliance in our theory of doxastic justification. And importantly, that kind of interactionist insight isn't just about the evidence, right? That's not just what's doing the explanatory work in saying why they're getting at the truth reliably. It's the prompting, right? It's the demand, it's the need to give reasons, right? That's part of what's explaining. It's the social demand and interaction and engagement that's part of the explanation. And if we just focus on, for example, individual acts of reasoning added up, or if we just focus on the reliability of the end of deliberation belief forming processes, we're not going to be able to account for that kind of prompting, the role that kind of prompting, social prompting plays in why we get at the truth. And I want to say that I think that there's a lot of support for at least the principles that are underlying my argument here in the literature, though not for the kind of belief forming processes I'm positing themselves. But for example, in Goldberg, when he's defending his extendedness hypothesis, one of the things that he argues for is that the justification-conferring process, or the things that we care about in determining the justificatory status of a subject's belief, has to be as expansive as the epistemic reliance is, right? So where there's epistemic reliance, there's something that we need to account for in our theory of doxastic justification. And what I'm saying here is that if we accept Mercier and Sperber's view, we should think that there's this kind of interactionist epistemic reliance. We rely on one another to prompt or trigger certain kinds of cognitive capacities that, when deployed in concert with others, allow us to get at the truth. Okay. So this might seem clear now why I think this is the case, but I think a significant consequence of my view is that not everything that's justification conferring is evidential. So often when we think or we give explanations about why a subject is justified in believing as she does, we think about what reason she has for in defense of her belief, what evidence she's basing her belief on. And what I'm arguing for here is that that can't be the entire story, because part of what explains why our beliefs are not an accident when we form them on the basis of dialogical deliberation is the social engagement with others, right? And it's that social engagement, that prompting, that's relevant as well. And that's not evidential, right? That's an interaction, that's a social interaction. Okay. How much time do I have? Just want to know how fast you are. I can jump into it in 20 minutes. Oh my goodness. Okay, I went a little fast. Okay, so I want to talk about an objection that I've thought about a bit. So sorry, how much is that? 20 minutes, okay. Including Q&A. Oh, including Q&A. Oh, okay. That makes way more sense. I was like, I thought you were telling me I was supposed to. Like, did I just do that in 10 minutes? Okay. All right, great. So let me just go through this objection before wrapping up. So one thought I've been confronted with is the following. Hey, Molly, even if I commit to a historical theory of doxastic justification, I am not committed to saying that everything that's causally related to the formation of a belief is justificatorily relevant, right? So for example, I drank coffee this morning. Surely that's part of the causal history of some of the beliefs that I formed. Maybe I would have failed to form certain beliefs had I not consumed coffee because I would have been more sluggish. And yet, do we really want to say that the act of drinking coffee bears on the justificatory status of our beliefs? Doesn't seem like that's the case. And the coffee example seems particularly problematic for my view, because we might think that drinking coffee reliably contributes to the formation of true beliefs, right? It's not just like a deviant causal chain. We might think, on the whole, when you are caffeinated, your cognition works better or something like that. And so it's part of the non-accidentality explanation for the truth of certain beliefs that we have. But even if we are committed to that, we don't want to say that's part of the justification conferring process for particular beliefs. So that's one objection that I'd like to address. And my reply focuses on the way in which Mercier and Sperber's defense of the interactionist theory is a teleological kind of approach. So let's just start with our perceptual faculties, right? So we don't think coffee is justificatorily relevant. Let's just stipulate that right now, though perhaps some may disagree. We don't think it's justificatorily relevant, but we do think, for example, the functioning of our perceptual faculties matters for justification. So what could distinguish between those two things? Well, the point of our perceptual faculties is to help us represent the world accurately. That's sort of what they're for. There's a teleological explanation that we can give. We can't say the same thing about coffee, right? The process or our capacity to drink coffee, but we can say that about our perceptual faculties. I want to say that in light of the way in which Mercier and Sperber defend their view, we can say that this dialogical capacity, this argumentative reasoning, this interactionist kind of epistemic reliance similarly has the teleological watermark, teleological epistemic watermark, right? They're telling us that this is what it's for. It's for convincing others, because when we engage in that kind of way, we can bootstrap our way to the truth, right? So my response to this objection is that it is epistemically relevant. Even it's not merely causally related. It's an epistemically relevant kind of causality because it has this teleological explanation. What is it for? It's for convincing others with the ultimate aim of getting at the truth. Okay, so what I've argued is that if we accept the interactionist account of reasoning, we should posit these interpersonally extended interactive justification conferring processes that extend beyond an individual subject's cognitive system. And I've also argued that a significant consequence of this view is that not everything that's justification conferring is evidential. And I just want to flag in terms of future work that I think this has a lot of consequences, both for just our general understanding of epistemic normativity, but more specifically our notion of epistemic autonomy, right? Because often we think of justification as a notion that tracks whether or not individuals get individual credit for their beliefs. And by positing justification conferring processes as socially interactive and extended, we really put pressure on that kind of attitude about justification and our ability to be epistemically autonomous. All right, thank you guys so much.
Thanks a lot, Molly. Maybe you can stop sharing the screen, then we can see who wants to ask a question online. And the floor is open. Let's try.
Thank you very much for the talk. It was interesting. Could you please go to the slide in which you talk about intermediary functions? It was at the beginning of the presentation. Yeah, one more. Yeah. It's a follow-up probably to our discussion, but it seems to me that to claim that Mercier and Sperber have recognized some kind of intermediate function, but the ultimate one, there is the formulation. I don't know if in this slide. So the intermediate function is supposed to be to convince others and to evaluate the arguments, but ultimate function is supposed to be our epistemic benefit. So as I read them, it seems to me that they capitalize, at least in the first papers, and also they repeat those formulations in the book, on the idea that the primary function is actually an ultimate function, is the social one. They just say that the welcome benefit, byproduct of this social function, is the epistemic benefit in well-organized, group discussion. That's a minor point. I know that, as I myself argued yesterday, it seems to me that they are ultimately pressed to adopt some kind of disposition, but it's officially, it seems to me that that's not their position, at least according to some formulation. That's not the most important point. I'm just thinking that they claim that the ultimate function of reasoning is social function, and the epistemic function is a kind of secondary function. And so that's a minor point. And maybe the major point that's connected to this discussion about my side bias. And it seems to me that you want to say that the externalist, reliabilist justification, which is consistent with this Mercier's Sperber theory, has to claim that the epistemic benefits of the dialogue are due to the kind of feature as biased thinking and so on, not in spite of them. Yeah, am I right? Do I understand that right?
Yeah.
So it seems to me that an interesting case to consider would be to consider cases in which the thinking and the arguments and reasoning of participant is actually less biased. Would it produce better results, better outcome than the kind of dynamics, dialectics in which people are biased? Because, then we would have, if we could prove that less biased reasoning in group context leads to better outcomes, maybe more quickly, I don't know, but to more reliable outcomes, we could eventually have some basis for arguing that if groups with biased participant eventually succeed, it's rather in spite of the bias than because of it or due to it. So that's my question.
Great, thank you so much. That's all super helpful. So I do see there as being a pretty significant transition between the 2011 article and the book. And I do think that based on the 2011 article alone, just saying reasoning has a social function, or reasoning serves a social function, seems right to me. But in concert with the book, I would argue that this notion of the ultimate function being our epistemic benefit is very much there. And I think, for example, when they say, this would lead to, there are parts in the book where they say, it's not that it doesn't lead to intellectual benefit for individuals, it just does so through the dialogue with others, right? So the way that I understand it is the sort of immediate kind of need that the reasoning capacities are serving is that I want to convince someone else, right? Or I want to figure out if what they're saying is true. It's this argumentative thing. But the reason that that's valuable is because it allows us to coordinate in a way that involves having accurate representations of the world. If we have a good plan about what we ought to do or what we ought to think or what we ought to believe, it's because we are achieving this epistemic goal of representing the world accurately. So that's just a response to the first point. And in response to the second, I think I would want to take another look at the studies. I wish I had the book with me because I remember there being, I'm pretty sure there's a passage where they talk about studies involving brainstorming, where brainstorming is characterized as sort of like a non-adversarial kind of dialogue, where people aren't critical in the same way, they're more open-minded, and that those are often and I believe that the result is that those are often less productive, but I'm going to want to double check that. But I appreciate that point about if there's less bias in group dialogue and they're more productive, that would put pressure on this view. That's certainly true. Thanks. Does that answer all the thoughts? Maybe not. Okay.
All right, great. Giacomo.
I think Mark Risjord might.
Hi, Mark, by the way.
Yeah, sorry. Why don't you go ahead and we will check what's up with Mark, because we couldn't, sorry, Mark, we couldn't see you for a moment there.
It's all right. A hybrid conference is always difficult. Hello, everyone. I'm really happy to be here. I really enjoyed the paper. I thought that was, I'm very sympathetic to the view you're developing. But as it's 6 o'clock in the morning here, I think I'm a little fixated on the coffee example. And more seriously, I want to ask how much outside of what we might think of as very direct, deliberative social processes do you want to expand your reliabilism? So if you're thinking, I thought your appeal to function was right. If, as I understand it, you're going to put this whole thing into an evolutionary context. So the question is, given the kind of social processes that have evolved and the cognitive processes that evolve with them, do we have reliable processes? Now, isn't it entirely possible and likely that through our niche construction, not only of language, but of things like coffee, they might actually be part of what makes the process reliable, in which case, and I can imagine all kinds of ways they might actually hook into the other social processes. And so they're not going to be a priori ruled out. It may be we need all kinds of physical material scaffolding that are as part of the process. Is that a line you're sympathetic with, or do you want to draw the line at the social material boundary?
Thanks for that question. Yeah, I find this problem really puzzling and very fun, and maybe an argument for why all your group events should be catered so that everyone not hungry and can engage reliably with one another. But I take the point. I think I just I do think I hope that there's a really principled way to distinguish between the kind of teleological evolutionary watermark that we see on our social capacities for giving and asking for reasons and something like drinking coffee. Though sometimes I do feel the pull of saying, let's just include more rather than less. And I think, well, after all, for example, if I was an evidentialist, I could talk about defeating evidence, I'm hungry, therefore I ought not trust my math skills right now, if we think that I'm hypoglycemic or something, right? And they get to say things like that and account for those kinds of considerations in their justificatory theories. And how could a process reliabilist do that? I think that the way to say it is maybe something like, and this is another something that I've tried to develop before, something like we actually want to attribute those things to context rather than to process, right? So strictly speaking for reliabilists, but we don't just care about the reliability of the process simpliciter, but the reliability of the process in the appropriate context. And maybe, the reliability of our perceptual faculties has to do, the proper context is a context in which the person is sufficiently, the area is well lit and the person isn't super hungry or under, so I wonder if there's a route like that as well, but thank you. Yeah,
thank you. That's right.
Right, no.
Okay, thanks, Molly. Really enjoy that. Okay, so I think I'm on board. I want to try to play the devil's advocate a bit and think about how somebody who defends very idealized notion of propositional justification would try to explain away your example of the group dialogical preparation. So they might say perhaps that the conclusion that the group reaches at the end can be illustrated as the conclusion that would be reached by a very idealized agent who went through each of the instances of asking for reason and giving reasons that was produced by the group. Just one person that goes through all that questioning. And that process would be the process that takes that idealized agent to fully appreciate the evidence that is there. What would you say to that?
That's really interesting. Thanks for that. So I was thinking about this I wonder if this is related to something that came up in the keynote yesterday at the very end about the suggestion that perhaps what we do, one thing that happens with the development of our capacity for reasoning is that we internalize the kind of social back and forth and our ability to do that themselves. It had a special name, if any, it began with a V. Yes. And so my thought is something like, well, if that's what we were doing in the individual case, and if I was a process reliabilist, I would just look at that process that I had used, where I had like taken on the devil's advocate within myself and looked at reasons for and against in that kind of way, and then operated on those and then ended up with a belief. We would take that entire process, not just the part where I considered like the good evidence. And then what we have in the case where it's like genuinely socially dialogical is that that's happening, but in between people. So like just as in the individual case, we wouldn't take the parts where the parts of the process where the individual is playing devil's advocate with herself. We wouldn't like take that out of the justification-conferring process. It's like part and parcel of why she's justified. Like so too in the case where we achieve this through social dialogue, we shouldn't like take out the bad parts. And that requires, I think, incorporating the social interaction into the justification-conferring process. Does that?
Yeah, it does. Cool.
Okay.
Thank you.
All right. Jeremy. Maybe I can also quicker, I think.
Thank you. So I'm actually not sympathetic to the question I'm about to ask, but I feel like an evidentialist or someone would ask this question of you. I wonder what would you say to someone who said, well, so what's justification conferring in this instance is the fact that your belief was produced by a dialogue that has certain qualities. And that in itself then becomes the piece of evidence. And then they would assimilate to other sorts of things like, well, the fact that you learned this from an authoritative source, or the fact that you got this from a textbook or something like that. And so then it becomes sort of this, this sort of meta statement about the source of the belief then becomes the evidence or something like that. So the evidentialist tries to sort of save the theory in this kind of way.
Is it almost like we're believing on the basis of the group's testimony or something like that? Like it's
something like that. You engage in a dialogue. The dialogue satisfies certain conditions, and so on the basis of this fact, the fact that your belief was formed on this basis is sort of that's what justifies. So it's sort of a kind of a meta thing that what justifies is not the dialogue, but the fact that your belief emerged from this dialogue, as it were.
Yeah, I mean, I think my externalist reliabilist roots are saying something like you could fail to have that as a piece of evidence with that you believe, and yet still be justified in the belief that you form after participating in the dialogue. And so there's still going to be, that just seems highly plausible to me that a group could engage in a dialogue, someone could walk away with a justified belief, and you ask them, or not even that they would have to say it, but if you were to look in their cognition, was there this meta belief about the reliability of group dialogue? It just wouldn't be there. So I think that would be part of the way that I'd want to resist that kind of view. But that's helpful. I'm going to put that in.
All right, we are unfortunately out of time. Let's thank Molly and then have a 10-minute break.